Imagine a place where America's past is so deeply woven into the land that the grandest of homes became the most sacred of cemeteries, Arlington National Cemetery. This is the Arlington House, a mansion built to honor George Washington that later became the home of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. But the story of this house is one of family, love, and a heartbreaking national conflict that tore it all apart. How did this family estate transform into the final resting place of our nation's heroes? And what happened to the family who lost it all? Get ready to uncover the secret history of Arlington House. Our story begins with a man named George Washington Parke Custis. He was the grandson of Martha Washington from her first marriage and was later raised by George and Martha at Mount Vernon after his father died. Custis inherited a large piece of land overlooking the Potomac River, and he had a grand idea. He wanted to build a home that would also be a living memorial to his famous step-grandfather, George Washington. Let's stop there and take a quick look at the family connections with General Robert E. Lee and George Washington. It all starts with Martha Washington. Martha Washington married Daniel Parke Custis. This was her first husband. Daniel and Martha had several children. One of them was John Parke Custis. John Parke Custis married Eleanor Calvert, who was actually the granddaughter of a very scandalous earl, the 6th Earl of Lord Baltimore, who was the last Baron of Baltimore, Frederick Calvert. John and Eleanor had several children, but two of them are Eleanor, also known as Nellie, and George Washington Parke. These were their two youngest children. And when John died, Eleanor felt that it was best that the two youngest children were to go and live at Mount Vernon with George and Martha Washington, who raised them as their own. George Washington Parke Custis is the one who built Arlington House in honor of his step-grandfather, George Washington, who is Martha's second husband. George Washington Parke Custis had a daughter named Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee. She ended up marrying Robert E. Lee, who was actually her third cousin. So this whole connection makes General Robert E. Lee's wife, Martha Washington's great-granddaughter. Now that we know the family relationship, let's get back to the house in Arlington National Cemetery. George Washington Parke Custis named the estate Arlington after the Custis family's homestead on the eastern shore of Virginia. This is the burial plot of the early Custis family in Northampton, Virginia, which overlooks the old Plantation Creek. The footprint of the original Custis family mansion is close by. According to a sign on the property, John Custis II built the original mansion on this site in the early 1600s and named it Arlington after a village in England, which was the birthplace and early home of his father. He spent years building the impressive Greek Revival-style mansion we see today. It was filled with many of George Washington's belongings, creating what Custis called his Washington treasury. This was just not a home. It was the nation's first memorial to George Washington, making its connection to the first president its very foundation. Matter of fact, the Washington Treasury included Washington's deathbed. The bed remained at Arlington's house until 1908, when Robert E. Lee's son, George Washington Custis Lee, donated it to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. You can see the deathbed at Mount Vernon today. The house was built and maintained by enslaved African Americans who lived and worked on the property. This complex history is a vital part of Arlington House's story. Despite its later association with the Confederacy, Arlington House was initially built as a monument to the Union's first president. After the emancipation, freed slaves were granted land by the government on the estate known as Freedman's Village. They survived by raising crops and lived there during and after the Civil War. There are 3,800 former slaves there on a plot of land known as Section 27. George Washington Parke Custis died October 10, 1857. At the age of 76, he was buried on the Arlington property and is now surrounded by the heroes of the United States. You have to ask yourself, did he request for his monument to resemble the Washington Monument, the monument of the man he idolized so much? At the time of his death, the monument was under construction, although construction was paused at that time. That little tidbit of information might be lost to history. George Washington Parke Custis' only surviving child was Mary Anna Randolph Custis. She grew up at Arlington, and in 1831, she married a young Army officer who was also her distant cousin and childhood friend, Robert E. Lee. Lee, an officer in the United States Army, would come to consider Arlington House his home for over 30 years. He and Mary raised their 7 children there, surrounded by the heritage of the Washington family. Their children grew up hearing stories of George and Martha, and the house was a center of family life. Hidden fact: Robert E. Lee never actually owned Arlington House. The property was left to his wife Mary for her lifetime. Upon her death, it was passed to their eldest son. Lee was simply the executor of his father-in-law's will. This detail is critical to understanding the legal battle that would come later. When the American Civil War began, Robert E. Lee faced an impossible choice. Though he was offered command of the Union Army, his loyalty to his home state of Virginia won out. He resigned from the U.S. Army and left Arlington House forever in 1861. Union forces quickly seized the estate. Its location on high ground directly overlooking Washington, D.C., made it a key strategic point. It soon became an Army headquarters. As the war wore on and casualties mounted, the need for a burial space became urgent. A U.S. Army quartermaster who had a personal dislike for Lee ordered that the land be used for a military cemetery. He believed the presence of soldiers' graves would make it impossible for the Lees to ever return. The U.S. government officially took the property through a tax sale, a move that would be challenged later. The official reason for the takeover, its strategic location, and the desperate need for a cemetery. The fact that it was the home of a Confederate commander was an added layer of purpose. Fun fact: the National Archives holds the famous resignation of Robert E. Lee from the United States Army. At the time, the West Point graduate had been recently promoted to colonel in the U.S. Army. But Lee resigned soon after the state of Virginia voted to secede from the Union. On April 20th, 1861, Lee wrote 2 letters, both from Arlington House. The one you are looking at was his resignation from the Army addressed to Secretary of War Simon Cameron, in which Lee simply wrote, "I have the honor to tender the resignation of my commission as colonel," but yet there was no reason given, no explanation provided. After the war, Mary Lee never returned to Arlington House. She and her family moved around, living in various places, and she passed away in 1873. But the fight wasn't over. In 1874, the Lees' eldest son, George Washington Custis Lee, sued the U.S. government for the return of his family's property. He argued the tax sale had been illegal, and in a surprising twist, he won. In 1882, the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, stating the property had been wrongly taken. However, the land was now filled with graves and thousands of Union soldiers. The government couldn't simply return it. So, in 1883, Congress voted to buy the property from Custis Lee for $150,000, which is approximately over $4 million in today's money. It was a bittersweet victory for the family, as they were paid for the land but could never get their home back. So there's a hidden artifact from the occupation in the home. Despite initial orders to stay out of the house, soldiers entered and some left graffiti, including messages and names on the walls. These inscriptions offered a unique glimpse into the lives of soldiers occupying the estate and their experiences at Arlington House. I was not able to find pictures of these inscriptions, but I did find a drawing that was made in 1862 by one of the Union soldiers. The picture is a depiction of Lee's daughter's room. What I can make out on the inscription is it was made by a man named Charlie, and it reads, "The Civil War, roughing it at Arlington House." Notice there is a soldier sleeping in the chair. Another artifact you may not be aware of is Old Fort McPherson. This was located within Arlington National Cemetery. Specifically, it was situated in what is now Section 11. The fort was established in 1864 during the Civil War, but was never fully completed and was abandoned in 1865. For many years, the incomplete earthworks could be seen near the modern Memorial Amphitheater, as shown in this 1939 photograph. Needing space for additional graves, in 1947, cemetery officials razed the fort's remains to create Section 11. The boundaries of this section between McKinley Drive and McPherson Drive correspond almost exactly to the perimeter of the old fort. But comparing the present area with this old aerial photo, you cannot see any features of the earthen fort at all. While Robert E. Lee is not buried in Arlington, as we have seen already, his father-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis, is buried at Arlington. Not only is he buried in Arlington, but his wife, Mary, is also buried right next to him. Their graves are located just a short walk from Arlington House, near what is now Section 13 of the cemetery. This is a pungent reminder of the family that once lived here. Many say William Kreisman was the first veteran to be buried in Arlington in 1865, but in truth, the oldest veteran and first to be buried on the grounds was George Washington Parke Custis. Lieutenant Custis was commissioned into the U.S. Army in 1799 and served for more than a year as an aide-de-camp to a general. Later, during the War of 1812, he shouldered a musket and helped man an artillery piece against the British Army at the Battle of Bladensburg during the unsuccessful defense of Washington, D.C. in 1814. Let's quickly get back to George Washington's tents, also referred to as marquees. After the Revolutionary War, the Washington family kept the tent pieces at Mount Vernon. After George and Martha's death, the tents were owned by their grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. He was known for giving away pieces of the tent as souvenirs. For many years, the tents lived with the Custises at Arlington House. Custis then passed the tents down to his daughter, Mary Anna Custis Lee. During the American Civil War, Union soldiers seized Arlington House and confiscated the tents along with other Washington family relics. The Union Army eventually sent the tents to the U.S. Patent Office in Washington, D.C. for safekeeping in 1862. After a fire in the Patent Office, the marquees moved to the Smithsonian Institute in 1881. They were not returned to the family until 1901, when President William McKinley ordered the tents and other Washington relics be given back to the Washington Custis descendants. This decision was significant as it symbolized the nation's healing from the Civil War and the end of the Lee family's fight to reclaim their property. The Smithsonian Institute and Valley Forge bought the office quarters tents and sleeping chambers. In 1955, the National Park Service bought the remaining pieces and reunited the collection at the Yorktown Visitor Center. Today, the dining tent is owned by the Smithsonian Institute. The office tent is owned by the Museum of the American Revolution, and the sleeping chambers by the Yorktown Battlefield Visitor Center. So here's a weird fact. As we mentioned before, George Washington Parke Custis was the oldest veteran buried in Arlington, but the first person buried on the Arlington property was Mary Randolph, a cousin of George Washington Parke Custis. She was the author of the best-selling cookbook, The Virginia Housewife, which is considered one of the first truly American cookbooks. In addition, her brother, Thomas Randolph, was the son-in-law of Thomas Jefferson. The grave, which is located 100 feet north of the Custis Mansion, was noticed when the house was being renovated in the late 1920s. Her grave is still there. Arlington House is more than just a home or a cemetery. It is a living piece of our nation's story. It shows us how a family's history can become forever tied to the grand and sometimes tragic history of a country. What part of the Arlington story surprised you the most? Let us know down in the comments below. Thank you for joining us today. We invite you to watch all our videos, from famous funerals to diving into the archives, to find generations of history.